Belief in God isn't just adding on a belief in a being called God to an already intact world. Hello, I'm Warren, the rector here at St. Columba's. Glad you could join me today for my message of the day. Yes, belief in God isn't just adding on a belief in this being called God to a world that sort of already makes sense. Because if that were true, then you could do the opposite. You could just get the scissors out and cut this little added on extra called God off, and the canvas would still be intact. God's not an added on extra, if you like. It seems to me that some atheists think that God is just like this added on extra, added on to an already complete world that is meaningful in an obvious way, and that this idea of God is just sort of like a complication, an unnecessary complication to what would otherwise make sense. So in that view, you could just get the scissors out and snip off the corner where God's situated from the canvas, and everything else would still be there and make sense just as much. No detriment, if you like, to the full picture. God just becomes an added complication. But I don't think, actually, that's just not how faith operates. Not Christian faith doesn't operate that way. It's just a straw figure or a misunderstanding that people might have about belief in God. As a Christian, I can see the world through science, for instance, but I see more. I can see a depth that is unacknowledged by a consistent atheist. This is important because it means that faith is not just a belief in God. Belief is a practice. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of seeing the world, myself, other people, etc. It's a way of making meaning. It's a way of seeing purpose, of seeing how reality is put together actually, and at a different level and complexity than would otherwise be possible. And faith produces a culture, if you like. It's rich in resources of human living, rich in art, rich in literature, philosophy, ethics. When you start actually looking at how faith is actually practiced by people, you can't just think that God is an added on extra that can be snipped off the corner to no detriment to the canvas. To remove God from the practice of faith is to have nothing left. And that's why I said on Sunday in my sermon that to hold the kind of view that has God just on the corner there that you can snip off and you can snip God off with no real consequences, is really a practical atheism. It's practical in that although one might believe in God, it is virtually the same as atheism, making virtually no practical difference. To actually acknowledge what faith is really like, what people of faith actually practice and do, is a challenge to those atheists that want to make a sort of caricature of faith, as though God's just this added on extra. Christian faith has functioned much differently than that in Western society, for example. You can't cut God out of belief without losing everything. And you can't cut Christianity out of Western history without losing so much that we hold dear. To this view, to understand, to actually look at how faith is actually practiced by people, it tells us something also about how people come to faith and sometimes lose faith. It's not about keeping one's life and view of the world and then adding on to an already intact world this belief in this being called God. Faith is actually a new way of seeing the world, because God is not just in the corner that can be snipped off or added on at will. And over time, faith changes everything. Not because Christians don't use science, for instance, but because we see science in a new context. We also see a depth and a beauty in the world, just as we see the tragedy of evil, suffering, and death in a different light because of faith. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.